Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here this morning. I know that some folks are still trickling in, but want to go ahead and get us rolling here because I know there's going to be plenty to discuss. Uh, Good morning. Welcome to the 2025 Curtis Holzgang Visiting Scholar Lectureship. For those who I don't know, I'm Scott Marcel, and I serve as the Chief Medical Officer here at Providence Portland Medical Center, where we're broadcasting live this morning. You can earn continuing educational credit for watching either the live stream or recording of this event. My colleagues, Kayla Tabari and Kevin Dirksen, who are both clinical ethicists at the Providence Center for Healthcare Ethics, are joining us this morning for our conversation with Dr. Lucy Kalanithi, and will be monitoring the question and answer throughout the session. So please do submit your questions. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Lucy Kalanithi, today. But before I do, I'd like to share a little bit of history about this lectureship. The Holzgang Visiting Scholar Lectureship is a program of Providence Center for Healthcare Ethics named for Dr. Kurt Holzgang, emeritus faculty at the Internal Medicine Residency Program at Providence St. Vincent Medical Center. During his tenure as Director of Critical Care Medicine, Dr. Holzgang was an inspiration in ethics education, especially for internal medicine residents and nurses in critical care. He was instrumental in establishing the Providence Center for Healthcare Ethics in 2000. Since that time, the center has become a recognized leader in advancing the importance of ethics in healthcare. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our 2025 Holzgang Scholar, Dr. Lucy Kalanithi. Dr. Kalanithi is a clinical associate professor of medicine at Stanford University. She is the widow of Dr. Paul Kalanithi, author of the #1 New York Times bestselling memoir, When Breath Becomes Air, which was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize and translated into more than 40 languages, and for which she wrote the epilogue. A graduate of the Yale School of Medicine, the University of California, San Francisco's Internal Medicine Residency, and a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford's Clinical Excellence Research Center, Dr. Kalanithi is a fellow of the American College of Physicians, a member of Alpha Omega Alpha, the National Honor Medical Society, and an honoree of Mass General Cancer Center's The 100, as well as Stanford Medical Center Staff Awards. She has implemented novel healthcare delivery models in primary care, hospitals, and health systems, and served on leadership boards for TEDMed, Coalition to Transform Advanced Care, and the American College of Physicians. She has appeared on stage at TEDMed, on NPR, and the PBS NewsHour, and in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and New York Times, among others. Her award-winning podcast, Gravity, explores narratives of suffering. Dr. Kalanithi lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with her very funny 6th grader. We are so honored to have Dr. Kalanithi with us here this morning. Welcome, and thank you for making the journey to Portland. And I'll turn it over to our panel.
5 years down the line, I don't know what I'll be doing. I may be dead, I may not be. If you asked me when I was 17 what I'd be doing with my life, I would have said, oh, I'd definitely be a writer. But found medicine was, in fact, the perfect place. I first began noticing symptoms in my 6th year of residency. Obviously, Lucy and I were both very suspicious that I had some form of cancer, but actually having the confirmation was still devastating. Since Katie's birth, my time with her has had a very peculiar and free nature. In all probability, I won't live long enough for her to remember me. And so the time is what it is. It's a careful balance. If you don't think about the bad case, that ending is going to be very rough on you and your family. But if you don't think about the good case, you're going to miss an opportunity to really make the most out of your life and time.
Dr. Kalanithi, thank you so much for being with us this morning. We're really looking forward to having a conversation with you about such an important book. For those in the audience who haven't read When Breath Becomes Air, can you tell us a little bit of Paul's story?
Sure. Excuse me. And thanks so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. Um, so that video was of my late husband, Paul Kalanithi, who died 10 years ago, actually. Can people hear me okay? Yeah. And he was a neurosurgeon and writer who at age 36 was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer while finishing his residency in neurosurgery. We had met in medical school, and like he said in that video, I'd always thought I would be a writer. And he was one of those people who came to medical school having really never thought that he would be a physician. His dad was a doctor, but he was sort of led in the direction of philosophy and ethics and literature. Um, and as a young person, interested in literature and poetry, was really drawn to stories about suffering and mortality and thinking about what it means to be embodied and live in a mortal body, and then sort of have a finite amount of time to create a life that feels meaningful to you. And as he was sort of going through his educational process, he also became really interested in thinking about mind and brain, and like the interesting fact of the brain being a physical organ, um, subject to all the laws of biochemistry and physics and entropy, but also being the seat of our identity and meaning making, and sort of became really intoxicated by that. And ultimately, like combining his interest in the body and mortality and ethics, realized that he wanted to be involved in those sort of deeper questions in a practical sense. And like you said, medicine was the perfect place to be engaged with people who were suffering and thinking, and both patients and clinicians reflecting on what are we doing for each other, and how do we face up to suffering that we can't change, and how do we make decisions that help us live the lives we find most meaningful. And so it really was, he joked, he wrote this memoir while he was sick, and he joked, like, isn't this the perfect gift to the young man who wanted to understand mortality, to end up at a young age diagnosed with a very serious illness. And it wasn't, but at the same time, what happened for him was, um, he was sort of grinding through neurosurgery residency and the technicalities and the brutality of the schedule and like the weight of all the decisions that his patients were needing to make. And then, sort of on the side, he found that he himself was losing weight and developed really serious back pain, and then developed a cough, and became sort of clearer and clearer that he was becoming sick. And sort of in a flash of a moment, he was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer after being admitted to his own hospital, Stanford Hospital, for expedited workup. Had this sort of really intense, unbelievable moment of looking at his own CT scan and rolling up through the images and seeing, tumors everywhere. And initially, we thought that he was, he was at the moment of diagnosis, like beginning to be consumed by this disease. We thought maybe he would die within weeks. And it turned out with the novel targeted therapies and, you know, getting that kind of advanced treatment, he was able to return to residency initially, even while sick and while facing this terminal illness or very serious illness. Um, and then over the course of 22 months, got sicker and sicker, and sort of transitioned really fortuitously from being a neurosurgery resident who did finish his residency and like briefly started a faculty job, like trying so hard to hold on to that identity and that day-to-day process of taking care of patients and feeling like an agent in his life and feeling like he was holding on to his old identity despite the illness. And then as he became too sick to work as a neurosurgeon, he had transitioned into writing, initially as a way to process the illness, like, oh my gosh, now I'm up against these questions myself. and this is so intense that I actually need to like step back and put a philosophical remove on it. And I'm reading and I'm writing, and I can treat this a little more intellectually so that I can even approach it at all myself. And then um, just through like, what's the phrase that it's like luck is where preparation meets opportunity. Like this idea where he had begun writing and then like suddenly had the chance to publish one piece and then had the chance to like take on a book deal and be writing as he was getting sicker and sicker. And I'll just say one other final thing, which is the fact, you know, like going through a serious illness or um, the aging process or just big changes in your life, like when you have something that upends your A, day-to-day life, and B, like sense of who you are and sense of identity and sense of purpose in your own life, like to watch a sort of new vocation grow during that time. And as Paul was getting sicker and sicker, his intellectual life was getting bigger and bigger. Like that was just such a wild thing to watch and a true stroke of luck. And, you know, there's this quote by Nietzsche where he says, he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. And it's this idea of like, even as things are crumbling around you, if you feel like you have a sense of purpose and connection to the world, um, you know, you can bear a lot of other things. And so, um, anyway, that was, it also was a like devastating time. There was so much that we couldn't change. There was so much that was immensely painful and sad. And at the same time, there was this really interesting through line for Paul of like these deep questions that I was hoping to answer. Like, turns out this is how I was going to answer them. And, um, you know, I think what he ultimately really wanted to do was to be able to grapple with his own mortality and sort of stare it in the face. And he ended up working really hard to do that and trying to put words around it. Um, and the really interesting thing was for me, you know, his memoir was published posthumously. And the editor and I like worked on the manuscript and had it published and like appended an epilogue to it. And my own career has involved like storytelling around what happened to our family. And when the book was coming out, I asked Paul's agent, literary agent, and said, like, how do you think this book is going to do? Like, do you think people are going to read it? And she said, like, it's either going to do like very, very well or terribly. I was like, cool, I know those were like the end of the spectrum, but like what's in between? And she's like, it just depends whether people want to pick up a book about dying and mortality by a man who recently died. And it turns out that they did. And a lot of people read it, and a lot of people in medicine read it, and a lot of people read it generally. And I think it's like, you know, speaks to the fact that people obviously are really interested in thinking about purpose and meaning, and young people are reading it, and that's very interesting. I talked to uh, one of the APD residency leaders in Providence last night about how her ninth grader had read it. And I was like, oh, that's so early to read it. But like everyone's thinking about these big questions. And I think also like within our culture, like dying and illness are so hidden and they're sort of everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And I think people understand, like, isn't that weird? Like, what a weird moment in history where we have all this technology, um, but we like are still trying to figure out how to use it with wisdom. And I think the same taboos that are outside the hospital about talking about death follow us into the hospital, and we grapple with that every day. And so it's just been interesting to sort of weave through that with Paul's book and see like people are so hungry for those conversations. And I know everyone in this room is having those conversations every day, and you're sitting here nodding. And so that's been a really interesting experience for me um, also. But anyway, thanks for having me. And I'm really glad to be here and talk about these um, issues with you.
Thank you for sharing a sliver of Paul with us.
Yeah.
We've spent, this is our second day with Lucy now, and something that I found so striking in all the conversations we had yesterday is that you can ask someone to summarize someone they love, and that's such an impossible task, and you can read a memoir, which is really quite personal. And even, so I love how you explained him in so many ways I wouldn't have known if I had only read the book. And it reminds me of with our patient stories, even if we could read a whole memoir about each one of our patients, we'd still know so little about them. There are so many themes I want to explore, like identity and taboo topics. And but before we get to some of those things, this is medical grand rounds. So I have to ask, what's most important to you as a physician when you reflect on what you and Paul experienced in the last decade since death, and how does that shape your own practice?
Yeah. So I'm an internist, and primary care is my first love. And then when Paul got sick, I started doing urgent care. And I thought, like, this is going to be so meaningless. Like, I'm not going to have my longitudinal relationships with my own patients. And I guess I'll keep up my clinical knowledge. And it turned out that that setting is also so interesting. So that's where I work now. And the way in which it's interpersonally interesting is that, you know, I meet a patient every day who's there for one thing that's worrying them that exact day. And we try to make a decision together about what to do about it. And we develop a relationship in a matter of seconds or minutes. Um, and that's really interesting. It's obviously less sort of ominous and filled with serious illness than um, any other jobs in medicine, but it's been really interesting. And I think the things that are most important to me in my career, I mean, I was sharing this yesterday, but I guess in a very big picture and then in a clinical sense, um, in a big picture, the way that my career started out was thinking about healthcare quality and healthcare cost. I was really interested in like how much of our GDP we spend on healthcare and how do we decide, you know, like quality adjusted life years, what's worth it, and how do we decide, like, you know, why does nobody care about primary care? And we're spending so much money, like we're spending a lot of money on things that don't get us better health and well-being, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody knows that we see it every day and wrestle with it. And um, you know, going through this like caregiving experience in my own life and seeing healthcare from the other side in my own life, um, you know, made me think about patient and families' experiences in a deeper way, you know, down to like the visceral details of what that is like. And through that process made me think about the places in healthcare where um, like the business case for improving healthcare meets up with the moral case for improving healthcare, which is so many places. But for me, that's thinking about end of life care and how we do that in a wise way, thinking about clinician wellness and burnout, where there's a massive business case for reducing burnout. Just given like attrition and turnover and safety and patient experience issues that come out of us ourselves being dehumanized and then trying to provide care through that. Um, and, you know, that's been really interesting for me. And then also, like, I've entered into this whole world of narrative medicine, which, you know, I knew some about, but um, that's sort of the field of really thinking about how storytelling happens in medicine and how we can all process our experiences and learn about the patient experience through narrative. And so I became more of a storyteller, which I never thought would be part of my own career, but um, you know, has brought me to show up more authentically in all kinds of patient situations too. Um, that's where I am right now. And I also like used to think of my career as like I'm on a path and then I'm kind of like walking up the mountain and it's like milestone, 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 milestone. And it's, you know, predictable and it's in academia. And I think like now, I think I used to think of my life that way too. And now I think of it way more as like a series of moments, partly because like all we have is the moment. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And like that's really clear to me. And, you know, that's clear to many of our patients. You have what you have right now and who knows what's to come. And then, yeah, so it's like right now I'm in like this moment, like the storytelling moment and the like middle school mom expensive expander in the mouth moment and just like, and then there's going to be another moment later. And so just even that thinking about how to build a career. And I think also like as you come out of residency, there's this narrative of like, you know, just there's one path, there's one way to do it, but you end up with relationships all over the country and like, you know, ways to sort of weave and change your career, like all through your time. And I think if you go to anybody you admire in medicine and say, how did you get to the job that you're in? Because I would love that job. It's like, it's never, ever a prescription. It's like, well, this happened and this happened. And then I turned around and this person was here and asked me if I would do this. And turned out that I love this. And so I just think that unpredictability is so much more mixed into our career paths than like anybody really talks about. And it's actually really freeing and like heartening. It's just keeping those relationships and keeping like, if you just follow your instinct at every decision, you can get somewhere unexpected and beautiful.
Sometime last night, between a lovely bite with you and Kayla and a few of our medical education leaders and putting down my second grader and fourth grader to bed, I got paged from one of our emergency room physicians about a normal issue that comes up in ethics, a particular patient care issue at a particular moment in time, usual themes going on about what's possible, what's most likely, how do we talk to the patient and family. And in this case last night, I was thinking a little bit about something that Paul wrote in When Breath Becomes Air about it seems like at times the unrealistic optimism is the only alternative to crushing despair. And I wonder if you'll tell me, what did he mean by that?
Yeah. Um, you know, I think, yeah, and it's like neither one of those is realistic or helpful. I think especially in cancer, but also across medicine, there's this battle metaphor that's everywhere, where it's like you fight or you give up. Like we'll fight it, we'll beat it. There's this sort of like armamentarium where you think like I'll become defended and I'll just keep fighting this illness. And that's the only narrative that there is. And maybe we can't talk about anything other than winning. Um, uh, and it's like it follows us into the ICU where like we have this technology that was like essentially invented for a battlefield, and then we're using it for people who are like 90 and really sick. And so it's like battle, battle, battle. And I think where most of us are as people is like very much in the messy middle, but the culture in medicine is like, yeah, to be thinking about those two outsides. I think the way Paul ended up thinking about prognosis and how to live in the uncertainty was what you were just describing, which is like truly being in a very uncertain place of how is this disease going to affect me in my life. Um, and initially, like thinking about Kaplan-Meier curves, like, is there any way I can figure out, like, using all this data, like, where's me? Where's me on that curve? And then I'll just sit there and I'll be okay. And you really can't do that. And that scenario of framing for patients, and this worked for him as best as anything could, and this is what I like too, is this idea of like, okay, here's this disease that you're facing. Here's this like, operation that you're facing. It's your knee replacement or it's your, incurable illness or whatever. And what's the best case that could most likely happen? Or what's the best case that could happen for you? What's the worst case that would happen for you? And then what's most likely to happen that obviously is in the middle. And in the face of this uncertain prognosis for Paul, maybe he'll die within weeks. Maybe he'll be the guy who ends up like leapfrogging novel therapies and then living 10 years or living with a chronic disease for a normal lifespan. And that would be the best. Um, but he sort of said to himself, like, when I think about myself and my own life, he said, he actually wrote this explicitly in the memoir, but if I had 10 years, I would go back to treating patients. If I had 1 year, I'd write a book. And if I had like weeks to months, I'd spend time with my family. And so once he was able to make that clear to himself of like, here's what I would actually do in the best, worst, and most likely instances, then as long as I'm like clear eyed about what's actually happening, then I can have what I want within the bounds of what's possible. Um, And like disease is it's such a moving target all the time. And so, yeah, facing up to that was what ended up being most helpful. But yeah, I think when you're first presented with an illness, it's like, you know, this idea of like, yeah, the unrealistic optimism. It's like, well, let's just have hope. Like, let's have hope. And then it's like, well, hope for what? Like hope for what? And that I think is like people can answer that in so many different ways. Like hope for doing this one thing that I really care about, like the people who are like, I got to make it to the graduation for this person I love, or hope for like minimizing pain, or hope for like my family being okay no matter what happens to me. And there's often like so many kinds of hope that we can actually provide and guarantee, like a bunch of them, if we're asking and thinking about that. But it does require like facing up to what's actually happening and communicating to a patient and family, not through one conversation, but through a whole bunch of conversations. Paul like made a joke where he's like, it's like the birds and bees conversation. It's not just like sit down and have it one time and you're like, are we good? Are we good? You go forth. It's like, it's just like a series of like tiny conversations all the time that help people sort of understand a landscape. And so um, that was what was most helpful ultimately.
You were referencing those early moments of learning about his illness and some of those early conversations. And I want to get to that identity piece. Oftentimes, when I'm teaching nurses, physicians, anyone in healthcare, I'll reference that what can make this job particularly hard in hard moments is that a lot of us have a mug or something that says, like, I'm a nurse. What's your superpower? And maybe accountants have those mugs. I don't know, but the ones that I know don't. And so I think those mugs, all the paraphernalia, if you will, remind us that it really does feel like an identity piece. I think oftentimes when you go into a field where you're not going to have great hours, rigorous, training's really difficult, and pay and all these different pieces, you're sacrificing something. And as a part of that sacrifice, maybe you trade that for belonging in a community and a sense of identity, and a way that people can kind of come to know you as, oh, that person is a physician in my community, that, what have you. And so when that changes, I could imagine that such a profound shift in who you see yourself as, and perhaps someone with Paul's same diagnosis. I'm so sorry to accountants in the audience, but someone with Paul's same diagnosis who is an accountant might have, time saying, well, I was an accountant and now I'm a writer. But to be a neurosurgeon and all of the training that requires, how did he process that shift in identity? And then what is it like on your end as his partner, or maybe with patients now as a physician, to help people think through those identity shifts? What does that look like?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I guess there's like two pieces to it, because it's true. Like being a physician, there's like, or like losing the ability to be a physician is like layer upon layer of changes in your identity. So there's like, oh my gosh, this thing was so meaningful in my life. Yeah, there's like the identity in my community. There's like, this is how I spent every day. Like, this is what I was actually doing with my time. Um, there's like, you know, young neurosurgeon dude, you're like, I have control over everything. Like, I'm in charge. The agentiest agent there is around here. And so there's that identity. Um, and so losing all of that, I think, is very hard for Paul. And especially like making the transition between like being a physician where you feel like you're in charge, and switching to being a patient where you're losing all of that identity stuff, but also like culturally, or just like in a hospital, you do become like faceless, you do become naked, you are in a very, very vulnerable position through a lot of structures that aren't that great. And so yeah, all of it was really hard. And I think like there's a piece where, I mean, watching him go through it, and what I feel like is true for many of our patients, there's a piece of like a real question that's like practical and existential, which is like, what can supplant this? Or what do you really love that you still are? Like, you're still the grandma, like, you're still like this kind of person with these kinds of values. Like, those things remain a common thread. And so there's like, what else can you build instead? Who still are you? And then just like a tolerating sadness and loss thing where you can't change the thing and you can't build a new thing. You just have lost it. And so, like, figuring out how to accept or how to soften. Um, and I think there's this idea of post traumatic growth where, like, that can happen in a lot of different ways, but I think people do find like figuring out how to handle the hard piece and either like learning about yourself through doing that or having that be a point of connection with other people who are going through a hard thing, whether it's like they just lost their job or they're grieving or just whatever. Like it might be a totally different kind of loss, but you have a language around loss or you have a language around or you just have the ability to like sit in it and be like, yeah, cool, I feel that too, like we're together. There's a lot of things that I do feel like people figure out come out of loss, but it takes a while. That the theologian and like writer Krista Tippett, I don't know, I'm sure people in here are fans, but she talked about how like she's a person who's out in the world having like really deep, meaningful conversations with people. She has like a beautiful podcast called On Being and a platform called On Being. And she talks about how she went through an episode of depression, like really serious episode of depression, maybe when she was in her 30s. And now she's older. And she says, like, I would not be doing this job, like having these deep conversations and meaning making. I just wouldn't be doing it had I not been in this really dark place myself in the past. And then she says, and I really value it, or I'm a different person from it. And then she says, but if you had come to me during that time and said, like, a thing will come out of this that will be great, she would just be like, this doesn't even compute at all. Like, that's not helping me at all. Or just like go away. And so she's like, whatever meaning you're going to take out of your own hard thing is like, can take a long time. And it's only up to you. It's not up to anybody else. Like, what comes out of it. So yeah, I think it's all of those things. And then just to mention it, like in this question about like what comes of suffering and how do people make sense of suffering, I really don't think like suffering is like, okay, we're all just like making it through our lives. And then suffering is this like side thing that like hopefully won't happen to us. It's like it already has, it definitely will. Like for me, I'm like, oh, this is what happened in the past 10 years, but like what's gonna happen in the next 10 years? Like something. And so um, you know, yeah, I'll just say this. I don't know if this like exactly matches up with what I was just saying, but I'll share it because I really love it. But when your husband writes a book like When Breath Becomes Air, like people come up to you and talk about the meaning of life. It's like, what do you think the meaning of life is? What did Paul think this is like? What do you think the meaning of life is? But one of the conceptions that I really like actually that answers that question is Viktor Frankl's framing, which he writes about in Man's Search for Meaning. But he essentially says that he thinks that meaning in our lives comes from three different places. And he says they're work and love and suffering. And he was a neurologist and psychiatrist who was in a concentration camp in World War II and lost many, many things and suffered a ton and watched a lot of people die and was sort of a counselor to other people in the camp and and sort of found that if people had any chance of survival at all, they were holding on to some purpose that they would have, whether it was a child who was waiting for them potentially, or whether it was like a series of books that they had been writing and they hoped to keep writing. Like people who like made it through by luck and fortune and grit, like all had something that was drawing them forward. And so after the war and after his experience, he went on to become like a therapist essentially and helped people make meaning out of hard situations. And he said, like work is one of the places where we get our meaning. And so that's like the things that we do and create. Love is place where we get meaning, obviously, which is like all the different types of love between human beings, and also like gratitude writ large about being alive. And then suffering as a place of actually finding meaning, whether it's like the pure fact of persisting through something that's really hard, um, can be really meaningful, or like having something come out of it, like a change in your own narrative, a greater sense of resilience in the future, et cetera. And I feel like it's interesting because we in our jobs, like our jobs are made out of work and love and suffering all on their own, like figuring out how to witness suffering, figuring out how to help other people make sense of suffering. And so like these jobs in healthcare are really special because I'm just like, oh, like we all have a sense of this, but they're just meaningful, like on the day to day. Um, so I forgot the question, but anyway, I guess
was
that's
a
where I would
perfect
end on
answer.
that one.
Gosh, there's so much in your last response. And it's really helpful to, you kind of teed up where I wanted to go, which was, what is the meaning of life? No, wouldn't do that to you. You know, I'm thinking a lot about the discomfort that there can be in the work, and particularly sometimes grounding ourselves in the moment that we're in. You had to fly several hundred miles north from the Bay Area to sit with us. Kayla and I had to wake up early and make sure our questions were all ready to go. But also for folks in the audience today, you know, these are my peers, my colleagues, and I've seen a remarkable amount of courage in being able to sort of inhabit a kind of deeper inner core to be able to confront suffering in the work. What I think that what really struck me about When Breath Becomes Air, and what I hear others reflect upon, is how it didn't just happen at work. It happened in your own personal life. And I'm going to make the discomfort cross the panel here into the audience. And I think in many respects, to have to confront this story of you and Paul is to confront how the suffering we see around us every day at work can penetrate these very tightly constructed veneers and these identities we inhabit outside of healthcare. So I'd just like to ask you to kind of jump into that morass if we can. Did your medical training help Paul confront this? I could imagine that some in the lay public might think, well, who better for that to impact than two doctors, really smart people with clinical experience? Maybe also you knew too much. Were there places of refuge that you could go to and draw upon, places that were really hard because of what you knew? Maybe reflect on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. About being two doctors. Yeah, and it is weird. It's like a lot of people in healthcare come to it like with like real bodily suffering that has happened to them, and that's what led them there, or like accompanying a family member through an illness and are not new to the personal experience of it. And then I think like a bunch of people who come to healthcare come into it young and like have been healthy, and you're in a hospital and it's kind of like, well, there's patients and then there's me, and like that'll never happen to me. Or and it's when you're in a hospital too, it's like you have to get your job done, like you you are walking through the halls quickly to complete your to-do list, and it's like the families like sleeping outside the OR are like kind of like the furniture. You're just like, I'm at my job. I got to keep moving. And so it is like a lot to toggle in and out. And it every once in a while, as you're doing your job, it like really hits you just like what's actually happening here. But not all the time because we have to get a whole bunch of stuff done. Um, yeah. And then I think like when you can tune into that and like we all know it's there and we've all done it, like it's actually really meaningful. And so anyway, it's all happening at the same time. Um, one thing that Paul said that was useful, like about that kind of like divide, it's like an artificial wall, right? There's like patients and us, and like maybe the fact that we're healthcare workers will keep us safe from illness, and it won't. And Paul ended up saying, like, someone was like, don't you think like, why me? Why does this happen to me? And he was like, well, it's kind of like, why not me? And that was helpful and comforting in a certain way. Yeah, why not me? Um, yeah, being two doctors, going through this experience, um, I feel like was very helpful in a ton of ways that you might expect. So like the main one was just the privilege of access and the ease, of like knowing how to get through the system, like the fact that like we avoided a couple ER visits because like I could examine and triage Paul, like understanding which medications to use in what order and what the side effects were, and like just avoiding like a lot of phone calls and ER visits and confusion and fear, was really helpful. And then at the same time, there's a most of like going through serious illness, like your textbooks will not help you at all. Doesn't matter how much you know. It's so much more about connecting to all the people who have faced the big questions about being a patient before. And I shared this yesterday, but Paul had this sort of instinctual understanding of that where, when we went into the hospital for expedited workup of like, oh, you're having these really ominous symptoms, like something's happening and we're going to find out today what it is. We were packing for the hospital, um, and I was packing like the phone charger and the insurance card and like a blanket. And Paul just packed books, and he packed, Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis and Being in Time by Heidegger, and then a novel about cancer called Cancer Ward by Solzhenitsyn. Um, and he wasn't bringing like a textbook or some, like some way to look up cancer stuff. He was just like, okay, like I'm gonna bring like stories and philosophy because like that's what's actually happening to me right now. Um, and um, he was like, I sort of had this hubris of like, well, I'm a doctor and like I understand illness. I've seen patients walk on this path. Like, I'll just go walk on the path because I know the path. And he was just like, this is a wasteland. This is just like some wind has come and like blown away the entire path. And I don't, I thought I understood this, but I don't understand this at all. And I actually think about like if or when I get sick and I'm really scared, like will I go read Paul's book and see phrases in it and just think like I had no idea. Like I was there for that and I had no idea. Um, and I wonder about that. And um, yeah, so there were a whole bunch of pieces that, were like unknown. And then I think there's like a lot of conversations that are also hard. Like we had a whole language about, decision making at the end of life and all that kind of stuff. And which was really helpful, like literally having any language to use to talk about it. We had a whole vocabulary and we had cases that we talked about over the dinner table and like just stuff to reference, like, or like, what does it mean to be in the ICU? And, what does it mean to get coded? Like just so much stuff that was really helpful, like viscerally to understand. And at the same time, like, um, to actually have a bunch of conversations that are hard to have, like I came to Paul and was like, I think we should figure out your advance directive. And he was like, I think we should figure out your advance directive. And it was just like, oh yeah, right. Like this is okay. And then, or like the decision about like, is this actually the moment to think about hospice? And like when you're a clinician, you're like, well, like time to have the hospice conversation. Like this is not going well. It's like, okay, this is obvious. But when you're the patient and family, it's like, whoa, like that's a brave, brave decision to like face up to the fact that now your goals of care are vastly different and you're like you are stepping into like letting nature take its course when what you were doing before was the real opposite of that. Or like we thinking about like Paul, after Paul died, he was buried, and his one side of the family is Hindu and one side of the family is Christian. And then he actually never said what he wanted to have happen to his body after he died. I think he was like, that's for you guys. And I think it was also just like too much. I think that was just like a little too much. to think about. And we ended up burying him, like partly because like English literature was his real love. And so it was like, um, I don't know, just like being buried, similarly to the great writers that he loved, like was what happened. Um, and yeah, but he didn't want to think about that. So it's like you are kind of just like weaving through what's possible to approach. Like, is today the day we could like approach this thing? Is like, should we soften and not do that yet? Like all of those same emotions, all of those same conversations were still like emotionally hard the same way they are for anybody. Um, but overall, it helped to be doctors a lot.
See, time flies by with you. Just incredible. Kevin's going to pull up questions that we have from the audience here soon. We'll open it up to Q&A. But before we do, I wanted to take us back to one last question that's actually sort of where we started when you said someone that you were working with said this book will either do phenomenally well or not at all. And it clearly has just been phenomenal in its reception. And it's been just about a decade since When Breath Becomes Air was published. I'm curious if you'll just share with us one little tidbit about something that surprised you in its reception. Maybe that it's been translated into so many languages, or you said ninth graders are reading it. But what else has surprised you about the book's reception in the last decade?
Um, yeah, totally. Like a million things. I mean, like one of the things that surprised me most was, well, this isn't like a big deal, but I just think of it all the time. I guess it's just like the different kinds of, like people come up and tell me their stories all the time, like in a bookstore or in a like meeting or whatever. And like the way that people relate all kinds of suffering to reading Paul's book is really interesting. Like one of the letters I got said like, I'm a deeply depressed person. And I know that's like nothing as serious as what Paul faced. But this book really helped me. And I was like, that is so much as serious as what Paul faced. And like, oh, I love that this person like found this book helpful because depression is like such a like painfully meaningless place to be. Like, you know, um, Andrew Solomon talked about depression and said like the opposite of depression isn't happiness, it's vitality. And I just think like thinking about depression and thinking about like having meaning wiped away and then trying to refine meaning through that process is so similar in some ways. And so like that analogy and that like sense of connection was really meaningful to me. Um, yeah, having it translated into a bunch of languages has been like really interesting. We have a like copy of a whole bunch of different ones, and that all of them say for Katie at the beginning, and but it's like written in like Cyrillic, and it's written in like, like Russian, and it's written in Hebrew, and it's like sometimes like Katie is spelled with a K, and like just because that's like how you would like transliterate it, I guess, and that's just like so interesting to see, and she really likes it. And then like the main thing that will be interesting for me is Katie reading Paul's book, which she's 11 now, and she was 8 months old when he died, and he's kind of everywhere and nowhere in her life. And most of the stories she's heard about him are like really pedestrian. It's like in a good way, I think, because not just like, here's your dad, the writer. It's like, oh, you love hot showers. Like I get so sweaty in a hot shower, but you love hot showers, and so did daddy. Like daddy could take an hour power shower just like you. Or like, like daddy loved dogs just like you. Or like she's a really good physical comedian, and Paul was really, really funny and did a lot of sketch comedy. Speaking of like what's absent from your memoir, and it was just like very funny all the time, like sort of wry. Um, and she's funny too. And I'm like, I'm not funny. I like to laugh a lot, but I'm not funny. And so like that through line is great. And like you're funny like a Kalanithi. And yeah, I'm just really curious like what the book ends up meaning to her. Um, and he was very aware that like he was leaving this book for her. He was in a rush because of her. And he sort of ends up saying like in the book, like you know, there's a passage that's written like in the second person to her at the end. And he's just like, I love you and you meant so much to me during this time. And then the whole book is kind of saying like, I think it's really important to try hard. I mean, I think the meaning of life for Paul, like partly was just about striving. Like it was like even striving to find a meaning, it was the meaning. Just like striving all the time to like learn and be better and try and like get your head around something that's hard to get your head around. And so like these ideas of like, I love you and I think it's important to try hard or just like what I think a lot of us would tell our kids. So anyway, we'll see. But that's going to be really interesting because if people are reading it in ninth grade, then that's not so far around the corner. Um, so yeah.
Okay. Love to open. Let me see. Thank you. I'd love to open Q&A now. Anyone in the audience before we get to folks in the chat? Happy to run a mic over to you.
I had a question. I realize now that there's a very similar one on the chat, so I apologize. I think this is more of a follow-up to one of Kayla's questions. I am very interested in this idea of identity and how it can be changed by illness. Javi Carrell calls it the betrayal of the body,
Yeah.
right? This idea of how we can change, we're changed through illness. So I just had a question of how do you think we in the healthcare setting can help patients through that? Is there a way that we can I've heard you talk about this of like how Paul's oncologist, right? Is there a way that you think that we can help patients through that change in identity?
I mean, yes and no, because I feel like that's the work that the person themselves are doing. But I think like so many ways, some of them are like skills that we learn about how to have a difficult conversation and show up to those. And, um, those are not like side skills, those are like the main event a lot of the time. And so some of it, I think, is just acknowledging the emotion in the room, like acknowledging that there's a big change in identity, like, just acknowledging it at all with a patient. And like that's a big deal to just feel seen in that way instead of just like, we're here to talk about your body and your treatment decision. Um, and I think, some of those questions about like, how can I help you achieve the things that are important to you? Like, what should I know about what's really important to you in your life? Um, what does a good day look like for you? Like, all of those questions are getting at identity and purpose. And then, um, oh, I was going to say something. Oh, yeah. And then, like, taking that information, obviously, as like a shepherd or a guide into your work where as you're approaching a patient with a treatment plan, you can say, like, here's what I know, here's all the things we know about these options for you. And so here's the one that I think will help you, like, will match up to you as a person, or here's the thing that I help with that will help you, like, achieve what you want to achieve. And the example with Paul's oncologist that we were talking about yesterday was um, when Paul was choosing, I guess it was a second line regimen, but um, after the TKI failed, but like which chemo to use. And the oncologist said, well, you're a neurosurgeon, so um, we should choose one where peripheral neuropathy is not one of the side effects. And some people wouldn't care as much about peripheral neuropathy and a little loss of dexterity or a little numbness. But for him, it was like a huge, huge deal. And so just knowing like even that kind of thing about what's your patient's vocation, how does your patient want to spend their days? And then toward the end of life, like, we were talking yesterday about this creative decision making about like, if a patient really wants to go home from the hospital, and it's like, please can I go home? Please can I go home? And it's like, well, what's the reason that you want to go home? And it turns out it's about the dog. And it's like, oh yeah, we could like figure out how to bring a dog here. like all of that kind of creative stuff that we can do. Um, but I think like truly just acknowledging it is such a big deal. Um, there must be a lot changing in your life, like what kind of things are happening for you right now. Just feels so good when someone sees that that's the case and then takes a little interest in it.
To try to be inclusive here of our folks, a few dozen folks joining online, I'm going to combine two questions, meaning I'm going to do a terrible disservice to both. What are some strategies to ensure that resident physicians are considering non-medical aspects of their cases? And some examples: social determinants of health, family dynamics, culture, religion, more narrative and reflective work. Maybe from your standpoint of inhabiting this role of a storyteller and narrative medicine, what kinds of possibilities come to mind?
Um, yeah, and it's like residents, it is so hard to be a resident. It's so hard. It's so relentless. There's so much work. Um, like just the pure fact of learning and executing the day is like more than anyone can handle already. Um, and so, yeah, like adding in the other things, like, what's happening for this patient psychosocially? How can I be asking these questions? I mean, I think like one thing that we can be doing as attendings and as other team members is like helping support that. Like, hey, like, I think it's like, well, I guess two things, like building it in to rounds, like let's make sure that like we know something about what this patient cares about. Like, what do they do with their days? Do they have a pet? What's the pet's name? Like, do we want to hang up a picture of the patient and their family and invite them to do that so we know what they look like in their everyday life when they have clothes on? Like, just any of that kind of stuff that we can do as like processes in the hospital to like actually be reminding ourselves that this is a person. And it's so crazy. You come into med school and you relate so much to like the patient, and then you switch over and like you end up having attendings who are like, don't forget that patients are people. And it's like, it's so crazy that like that's the situation we end up in, but it's like such hard work that you can forget. Um, uh, oh, I was just going to say something that I forgot about residents. Oh, I can't remember. I think like as you sort of like are moving through residency, like one thing that is important to patients, I think that we can be learning to do is just trying to think about like, what's this actually like for the patient? What's this gonna be like for the patient? Like alarms all night or like vitals all night is like really hard to deal with. And so it's like, can we stop Q4 vitals on this patient overnight? Like probably we can. um, like when the patient and family goes home, like, do they actually understand like what their follow-up is going to be and what the medication changes are? Like, just like making sure that those things that are like really important for someone's real life and experience and like continuity and understanding and like ability to sleep or space to ask a question, like even these tiny things like, you know, I don't know. I think you learn them as you go along, but like just trying to understand like what are we actually doing here for this person and what is it like for them? Um, or taking a second to ask a question of a patient, like what do you feel like is missing for you right now? Like, is there a thing we can do for you right now that's going to make it feel like, you know, what can we do for you right now that we're missing? Um, but yeah, I think some of that when you're a resident is like just the nuts and bolts of learning how to inhabit like, when I was at I worked at Kaiser for a while in Northern California, and um, we there was a lot about patient satisfaction scores, which was great. It was like you got your scores back, and like how are you doing? And there were a couple things where they said like, your patient satisfaction score will go up 20 points if you ask the patient like, how is this illness affecting your day to day life? And like people like patients loved it, and like that's so obvious, but like even if as a resident, you just carry around with you, like, okay, every patient as I'm, you know, doing an H&P or as I'm like at some point in their hospitalization or when they come to me and I'm the new PCP, like, how's this illness affecting your day-to-day life? Like, all I do is just ask that one question and then make sure they understand like the transition of care and what's going to happen next. That's it. That's all I can do right now. Like, that would be great. That's great.
So we're right at time, but I'm going to ask one final question that I'm going to borrow from our conversation yesterday. I would imagine it's been about 10 years since you were sitting down and writing an epilogue. What would you tell a younger Dr. Lucy Kalanithi today from Portland, Oregon?
Yeah, other than like go to Powell's Books in the Japanese garden. Uh, yeah, I mean, we were talking about this yesterday, but I mean, I think what I would go back and tell myself right after Paul died, which was such a disorienting moment for me, like that was the wasteland for me, was just like, it's going to be okay. And I think that like reformation of like who you are and what comes out of this moment, you know, when you're going through something really hard. I remember my mom saying, like, this just seems so bleak right now, but I promise things will fill in and like recreate for you. And I was just like, I don't think that's true. Like, I think it's just like game over. Like, I don't understand. I can't imagine feeling okay again. And then it's like, that does happen. And I think if I didn't believe my mom, but I think if I had come back and said, it's going to be okay, then I would have believed me. And so that's what I would say. And I think that's like almost always the case is like, it's going to be okay, maybe in a way that is really different from what you thought or, you know, something, but it's like, it's going to be okay. You just don't know yet what okay looks like.
Well, with that, we'll draw things to a close. We want to thank you so much for being here, for honoring Paul 10 years later. And we just thank you for the opportunity to reflect with you and to get to know a little bit more of the story. So thank you, Lucy.